Did Jesus declare all foods clean? The purpose of this video is to offer a defense of Jesus' statements in Mark chapter 7 against the misinterpretation of those who use this passage to say that Jesus somehow took away the prohibition of eating unclean animals. This video will be specifically addressing whether he truly declared all foods clean. I will be examining the nature of ritual and non-ritual impurity, which is important in understanding the context of Mark chapter 7. As well as what would have been understood as food by Jesus, his disciples, and the Jewish opponents of that time, in order to understand the implications of his words within their historical and cultural context. Let us start by reading the passage. He said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer?" Thus he supposedly declared all foods clean. And he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." Let us begin by assuming that this translation is accurate. Let us assume that. Let us also pretend that the context isn't about ritual impurity, or that the context doesn't matter. Let us say that Jesus purified all foods, without a clue about what purification means, or what is being purified or cleansed, in which we will get into later. What food is Jesus talking about? What did Jesus have in mind when he thought of food? Did he think the same way as Gentiles do? Did he consider all meats to be food? No. Did his disciples consider all meats to be food? No. Did his Jewish opponents consider all meats to be food? No. Thus, if Jesus did not consider pork, for example, as food, he could not declare pork as clean. Therefore, any food that was declared as clean is within the premises and category of what Jesus thought of as food. In order to respect and understand Jesus' words, we must allow him to speak to us and not impose our own understanding of what food is into his mouth. Many cultures and people have different views of food, ranging from humans to excrement. It is nonsense to then think that Jesus declares your own concept of food as permissible to eat, when that's not what Jesus had in mind. If we care to respect Jesus, then we will think like him and share in his own understanding of how the world works, and especially what he views as food. Let us get into the context of Mark chapter 7. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Hugh Craig Skinner states, "The Pharisees were scrupulous about washing their hands as part of ritual purity, though this rule was not found in the Old Testament." This establishes the context for the kind of impurity being addressed. That is, the need for ritual hand washing to remove impurity. But what kind of impurity will require a ritual process of purification? It would have to be a type of impurity that can be transferred and removed through ritual means. In Mark chapter 7, according to the Pharisees, that ritual process of purification is hand washing. This was not a matter of hygiene, which is a common misconception, although certain purity practices, such as those shown in Mark chapter 7, may resemble or look like hygienic concerns. Ritual impurity is not the same as being clean in the generic sense, as if someone were simply trying to remove germs. When someone is considered pure, it simply means that the person does not have any of the impurities explicitly listed in the Torah. So a person could be physically covered in filth or gross stuff, but if none of that filth includes the specific sources of impurity described in the Torah, then that person would still be considered ritually pure and ritually undefiled. The primary purpose of these regulations was not about physical cleanliness, but about maintaining ritual purity in accordance with the law. In the context of Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees were extending temple purity laws into everyday life, expecting ordinary Jews to observe purity standards when it is not always required. What is ritual impurity? They are impurities that are transferable and can be remedied through specific ritual actions. But what kind of impurities would that be? The sources of ritual impurity would be lepra, genital discharges, and corpse impurity, most of which originate from the human body, while others come from animal carcasses, and all of which render a person impure externally, and which can be ameliorated by the prescribed ritual means. Now, if someone becomes ritually impure, are they commanded to wash their interior? The answer to that is no. The Torah only prescribes washing the exterior, because there is no concept of ritually purifying the interior of the body. As Matthew Thiessen writes, those who contract these impurities wash the outside of their bodies, not the interior. That is why Jesus states, there is nothing outside of a person that is able to defile him by going into him. Why? Because nowhere is it stated that a person's inside is defiled once they contact ritual impurity. There is no ritual process of purification on the interior of the person, only the exterior. Why does it matter? Because Jesus is focused on that which goes into the person, or as is stated in Matthew, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles him. Jesus is confronting the belief that one becomes ritually defiled by eating defiled food, a belief that is not stated in the Torah. According to Jesus, in this statement, the law never claims that ingesting ritually impure food renders a person unclean. As he states, but the things that go out of a person are the things that defile a person. So what comes out of a person that defiles a person? That would be the sources of ritual impurity, which is lepra, genital discharges, and corpse impurity, most of which come out of a person and can defile others. Prohibited animals, however, fall into a different category of impurity, one that should not be confused with ritual impurity. This is demonstrated by the absence of any ritual process for purification after ingesting unclean animals. If eating unclean animals transmitted ritual impurity, the Torah would have specified the appropriate ritual remedy, as it does for other sources of impurity. The lack of such prescription indicates that this is not a transmissible ritual impurity of the kind discussed in Mark chapter 7. As the scholar states, it would be a mistake to include impure animals in the category of the ritually impure, because impure animals are not impure in the same way that lepra, genital discharges, or corpses are impure. In contrast to ritual impurity, which can be removed through a combination of time and water, and with corpse impurity, the ashes of a red heifer, nothing can remove the impurity of unclean animals. Nothing a pig does makes it impure, and no one can purify a pig. There is no way to make a pig kosher. It is ontologically, one might say, genetically impure. It is born impure, passes on that impurity to any of its offsprings, and then dies impure. So such animals are by their very own nature impure. This distinction between prohibited animals and ritual impurity was noted by early interpreters of the Hebrew Scriptures, as the scholar Logan Williams states. The evidence indicates that many ancient Jews distinguished between the domains of Tohora, ritual purity, and kashrut from very early on. Kashrut is in the category of dietary laws, the laws concerning which animal is permissible to eat and which are not. The scholar goes on, as Clauwen points out, the early distinction between kashrut and ritual impurity is indicated by the fact that the topic of prohibited animals, let alone any ostensible capacity to contract impurity from prohibited animals, does not appear at all in Sedir Tahorot, the order of the Mishnah that deals with ritual impurity. This suggests that the prohibition against eating certain animals was understood not to be based on a putative capacity to transmit ritual impurity. Rather, ingesting non-kosher animals is prohibited, and eating them makes people morally impure, because in so doing, they have transgressed. What one needs when they ingest a non-kosher animal, then, is not immersion to ameliorate ritual impurity, but rather forgiveness for transgression. So why does it matter that prohibited animals don't appear in Sedir Tohorot, the order of the Mishnah that deals with ritual impurities? It matters because this absence reflects how ancient interpreters and recorded disputes that could go back to even the first century of the Hebrew Scriptures distinguished between ritual impurity and prohibited animals. They were treated as two separate issues. If eating prohibited animals, such as pork, rendered a person ritually impure, then such laws would have been included in Sadir Torot, which deals extensively with a complex system of ritual impurity. This distinction suggests that eating something like pork does not make a person ritually impure in the same sense as lepra makes one ritually impure. Rather, it is prohibited not because it conveys ritual impurity, but simply because God said so. It is within this conceptual, cultural, and religious framework of purity and laws functioning in Jesus' time and culture by which Mark 7 should be understood. Therefore, prohibited animals have nothing to do with the context of Mark chapter 7. Unlike eating prohibited animals, acquiring ritual impurity is not inherently immoral. Ritual impurity defines our mortal state, not our moral state. Being impure does not indicate our moral state, but our mortal state. Simply put, it indicates that human beings are mortal. It is not sinful, for example, to menstruate or to engage in sexual relations within the bounds of marriage. There are, however, certain exemptions like entering into sacred space in a state of impurity, which would be sin, and a high priest in particular is more strictly prohibited from contracting corpse impurity. Giving birth results in a state of impurity, yet it is not a sin. Similarly, fulfilling the obligation to bury a dead body renders one impure, but this too is not considered sinful. Rather, these laws reflect a system of ritual status tied to holiness, sacred space, and it was made for the good of man to dwell with God and for God to dwell among men. As the scholar Matthew Thiessen writes, when the profane comes into contact with something ritually impure, the profane becomes ritually impure. The legislation of Leviticus chapter 12 through 15 and Numbers 19 deals with some of these ritual impurities. Such combinations of the profane and the impure were natural and generally inevitable. For instance, childbirth, menstruation, and sexual intercourse result in ritual impurity. These are natural human functions. The majority of Israelites would have at one time or another experienced such ritual impurities. Priestly legislation does not prohibit Israelites from contracting such impurities, nor does it punish them for doing so. Priestly law assumes that people will endure such impurities and provides them with the ritual means to remove these impurities. Only in the event that people do not properly dispose of their impurities does the issue become one of wrongdoing. When a person who has a ritual impurity comes into a sacred space, he or she sins. This person should have used the divinely appointed ritual means to remove the impurity before coming into contact with the sphere of holiness. Now for prohibited animals, one can say eating prohibited animals constitutes a violation of God's command and thus falls under the category of moral impurity, an impurity stemming from disobedience rather than physical or ritual contamination. It is not then that impurity that renders a person unfit to enter sacred space, but the impurity of disobedience that damages one's moral and covenantal standing before God. Moral impurity is also a distinct category, yet sometimes can overlap. Knowing the distinctions is also very important, as the scholar Matthew Thiessen writes. Conflating moral impurity with ritual impurity, something that New Testament scholars, theologians, clergy, and laypeople have frequently been guilty of doing, impinges upon our understanding of the gospel narratives. Another clue indicating that the issue in Mark chapter 7 is not about prohibited animals is the nature of the Pharisees' accusation. Unlike other passages where Jesus is challenged for supposedly transgressing the Sabbath law, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath, for example? In Mark chapter 7, the objection is based on a failure to observe the traditions of the elders. The Pharisees do not accuse Jesus or his disciples of sinning, but of neglecting extra biblical practices, that is, ritual hand washing before eating. This is an important distinction. It situates Jesus' response within a legal and interpretive debate not over the Torah's dietary restrictions, but over the authority of oral traditions that was beyond the written law. As the scholar Logan Williams explains, Jesus' response in Mark chapter 7, 15a and 18b, that ingestion cannot make a person ritually impure, does not oppose any purity regulation in the Torah, but rather contests the basis for extra-biblical purity practice of hand-washing decreed by the elders. So Jesus is not rejecting the Torah's purity system, he is challenging the extension of that system through later traditions. This context further supports the view that Mark chapter 7 is not about declaring all animals clean, but about defining the boundaries of ritual defilement that is in line with the law. One of which is, according to Jesus, nowhere is it stated that ingesting ritually defiled food defiles a person. One may object with certain verses, like Leviticus chapter 11, 24 through 26. By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever carries any part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Every animal that has divided hoofs, but is not cleft-footed, or does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Everyone who touches one of them shall be unclean. These verses do indeed describe a ritual process of purification, namely waiting until the evening and in some cases washing garments. But it is important to note that this applies specifically to touching or carrying the carcass of an unclean animal, not in ingesting it. Again, the Torah never prescribes a ritual for purification after eating a prohibited animal. While the contact-based impurity described here is relatively minor and temporary, it still demonstrates that physical contact with animal carcasses, whether clean but improperly slaughtered or unclean, results in ritual impurity. This principle extends to human corpses as well, which transmit a far more severe form of impurity. The laws concerning impurity through touch or contact, whether with animal carcasses or human corpses, is widespread within the Torah's purity system, even though the severity and purification process differ depending on the source. However, the absence of a ritual purification process for ingestion suggests that eating unclean animals was not viewed as ritually defiling in the same sense. Instead, the act was prohibited on moral grounds, not because it transmitted impurity in the ritual sense. Another objection would be to bring up Leviticus chapter 11, 39 through 40. If an animal of which you may eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Those who eat of its carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening, and those who carry the carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening. This verse specifically identifies the kind of animal, stating if an animal of which you may eat, indicating that it refers to animals that were permitted for consumption, unlike Leviticus chapter 11, verse 24, which does not make that assumption that the animal was intended for eating. If such an animal dies, for example, if a cow dies in an improper manner, if anyone were to touch its carcass, that person will be unclean until evening, and those who eat of its carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until evening. This is also stated in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 15. All persons, citizens, or aliens who eat what dies of itself or what has been torn by wild animals shall wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. Then they shall be clean. This is also repeated in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 8. These laws apply broadly to all animals that die naturally or are torn, not just those deemed unclean by species. Thus, the source of ritual impurity is not the animal's ontological status as unclean, but its status as a carcass. The animal's ontological status as unclean is in a different system of uncleanliness and has nothing to do with ritual impurity. The purification process is applied generally, regardless of the animal's permitted or prohibited classification, indicating that impurity in these cases derives from the manner of death, not the species itself. Any reason, though it is still debated as to why touching a dead corpse or carcass would transmit ritual impurity, is that such things embody death. This principle is also applied to other sources of impurity, which in some sense represents the diminution of life, representing death and mortality. As the scholar Matthew Thiessen states, what is holy must be the antithesis of death and mortality, life. And so that which is holy cannot coexist with impurity. That which is life cannot coexist with death. Such things indicates death and mortality, therefore opposed to life and immortality. By this there may appear to be a contradiction between Jesus' own statement when he states, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, yet in Leviticus it may appear to state something different, as it states, all persons, citizens, or aliens who eat what dies of itself or what has been torn by wild animals shall wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening, then they shall be clean. It seems to indicate that there is something that defiles by going in a person, that is, eating that which dies of itself or that which has been torn by wild animals. Again, Jesus is within a legal debate among Jewish interpreters of his time. In what sense is one ritually impure? How does one become impure? Jesus, as the ultimate interpreter of the law, already has his position within this debate. That is, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. The scholar Logan Williams gives an example of how early Jewish interpreters would struggle with texts like Leviticus chapter 17, verse 15. Found in a section of the Sifra, it states, "Perhaps it defiles clothes while in the stomach. It is taught, he shall launder his clothes, wash in water, and he shall be impure until the evening. And then he shall be pure. It does not defile clothes while in the stomach. Perhaps it does not defile clothes while in the intestines, but defiles clothes when in the mouth. It is taught, Nefesh, the Nefesh is what defiles and not in the intestines and not in the mouth." So what does this mean? The scholar writes, "The conclusion here amounts to a precise physiological rendering of Nefesh, according to which the location of defilement is the esophagus. The fact that Sifra cycles through numerous interpretive possibilities signals that the precise mechanism of defilement in Leviticus chapter 17 verse 15 was not immediately clear to early readers. We could imagine, therefore, that it was not impossible that someone held the view the Furstenberg proffers. In light of the parallel passage in Leviticus chapter 11, 39 through 40, and in light of how specifically the clothes require washing as the amelioration for impurity, it is possible that some Jews could have understood Leviticus chapter 11, 39 through 40, 17:15, and 29:8 as signaling that one was defiled by touching the carcass, not by ingesting it. The view that Furstenberg gave was, as Furstenberg argues, Jesus' conviction that it is impossible for impurity to transfer to humans by ingestion exhibits not an opposition but a conservative commitment to Torah, since no biblical source actually suggests that contamination can spread through ingestion. So this likely reflects the position that Jesus himself held, in contrast to certain rabbinic interpretations, such as those preserved in the Sifra, which attempted to pinpoint the precise anatomical location of defilement, suggesting, for example, that defilement may occur in the esophagus, but not in the stomach or mouth, and also the belief that it comes specifically from the carcass of a permitted bird, as stated in Rashi's commentary on Bishabat 13b. According to the Torah, there is no food that defiles a human who eats it. Here he agrees with Jesus, but the difference is when he says, "Except the carrion of a pure bird," and even less so food defiled by touching primary source of impurity, but they, the rabbis, decreed this rule. Here he acknowledges that these exceptions are rabbinic traditions and agrees with Jesus' interpretation of the Torah that there is no food that defiles a human who eats it, as Jesus affirms that defilement does not occur through ingestion at all. As he states, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. Here he disagrees with other Jews of his time on the question of whether one becomes defiled by ingesting ritually impure food. So the question is, why would Jesus have such a position? This interpretation is based on certain things. Let us look at Leviticus chapter 17 verse 15. "All persons, citizens, or aliens who eat what dies of itself, or what has been torn by wild animals, shall wash their clothes, and bathe themselves in water, and be unclean until the evening. Then they shall be clean." As we have seen before, there is no process of purification in washing the interior. The text states that those who eat what dies of itself, or what has been torn by wild animals, should wash not their interior, but their exterior. They are to wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water. If the interior were to be defiled, why would one need to wash their exterior? That is, their clothes. Therefore, as some early interpreters would interpret the passage of Leviticus 17 verse 15, Jesus most likely was in line with their interpretation that this is talking about defilement by touch and not by ingestion itself, as one would need to touch the carcass to eat it, therefore defiling their exterior. This issue was complex even for early Jewish interpreters, as reflected in debates preserved in rabbinic traditions. However, the language used in Mark chapter 7 suggests that Jesus positioned himself within this legal discussion, contrasting between other competing models of ritual impurities, taking a strict Torah-based stance that eating ritually defiled food does not render a person impure by ingestion. His argument basically is that the Torah never says that eating ritually defiled food makes one ritually impure by ingestion. It never was the case that eating unclean food defiled you. Therefore, stop bothering others for not ritually washing their hands. Again, as Furstenberg argues, Jesus' conviction that it is impossible for impurity to transfer to humans by ingestion exhibits not an opposition but a conservative commitment to Torah, since no biblical source actually suggests that contamination can spread through ingestion. Therefore, as the scholar Matthew Thiessen writes, the entire context of the clause of Mark chapter 7 verse 19, purifying all foods, situates this statement within a debate about whether one must ritually wash one's hand prior to eating. That is to say, the story simply does not intend to deal with the question of whether one should eat pork or shellfish. Rather, it intends to address the question of whether one can defile kosher food with one's ritually impure hands, and then introduce that ritual impurity into one's body by the consumption of that defiled food. According to Mark's Jesus, the answer is no, because of his legal position, that it is not what goes into the body, kosher food that has supposedly been defiled by the impure hands, that makes something impure, but what comes out of a body. As we have seen, impurity moves from the body outward, which Jesus uses as an analogy for moral impurity that comes from the innermost part of a person and moves outward, defiling the person in a more serious moral way. Matthew Thiessen writes, Jesus' reference to moral impurities illustrates the way impurity acts in general. Impurities come out of the body rather than enter into the body. This legal principle applies equally well to ritual impurities. Genital discharges, lepra, and corpses emit impurity when they come out of the body, and those who contract these impurities wash the outside of their body, not the interior. At least one later rabbinic passage concurs, calling ritual impurities impurities that come out of the body. As stated in Mark chapter 7 verse 20, and he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. So both ritual and moral impurities come forth from a person. They don't defile through ingestion, so there's no need to ritually wash your hands before eating, though you might still do it for hygienic purposes. But what other reason would there be to not worry about whether ritually defiled food enters into the person? As we will see later, the stomach purifies all foods. So Jesus shifts the focus from external ritual purity to the more weightier matter of internal moral integrity. As stated in Mark chapter 7, 21 through 23, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come, fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So Christ isn't making any ontological change here. Rather, he is basically practicing a kind of legal jujitsu, if you will, by interpreting the law appropriately, and then makes a lesson out of this by shifting to the more weightier matter of the law. So we have established that Jesus is correcting and explaining the law. What the law, according to him, doesn't actually say about ingesting defiled food, but what other reason would there be for stating that one isn't ritually defiled by eating defiled food? His reasoning is, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer, and supposedly he declared all foods clean. There are problems with this translation. The Greek does not say, thus he declared all foods clean, since it introduces a new subject, thus he, in a finite verb, he declared clean, that aren't present in the original. Instead, the Greek reads strictly as, for it does not enter into his heart, but into the stomach, and goes out into the latrine, purifying or cleansing all foods. Many translations treat that clause as a narrator's comment, rather than part of Jesus' statement. However, considering the evidence, that traditional clause is the least likely interpretation. To put it simply, most contemporary scholars would assert that the implied subject of katharison is Jesus, the he in lege, he said, which provides a masculine singular noun for the participle to latch onto. Since katharison is masculine singular, it must refer to a masculine singular noun or pronoun. Therefore, according to most translators, it will be the implied Jesus declaring all foods clean. However, as Logan Williams has argued in his study, the subject is not Jesus, but the person, the anthropos, the one being discussed in the immediate context. Anthropos is also a masculine singular noun, and thus can grammatically fit as the subject of katharison. As the text says, do you not understand that everything that is outside that goes into a person is not able to defile him, for it does not enter into his heart, but into the stomach, and goes out into the latrine, purifying or cleansing all foods? According to this reading, it is the person, the anthropos, who purifies the food through the natural digestive process. The masculine singular pronouns in the previous clauses all refer to anthropos. Thus, the person purifies all foods, as it goes into the person, not defiling him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and out of the stomach it purifies all foods. Another point is that the use of the article before Brahmata, the foods, may be more specific, not as a universal declaration that all foods are clean, but that the particular food ingested by the person is clean, mainly through the natural digestive process, implying that all foods that go through the digestive system is considered clean. So while the subject could be the implied Jesus, the lege, which is masculine, he cannot be the grammatical subject of the immediate sentence, which is more focused on the person's digestive system. It is more probable, in light of the overall context, that it picks up the more proximate masculine singular noun, anthropos, as the scholar Logan Williams states. The prima facie evidence in favor of this reading of the participle is that anthropos and the pronoun autos are used 3 times in the preceding clauses, and this provides a masculine referent which is proximate to katharison and could function as its subject. We could therefore translate Mark chapter 7, 18b through 19 in the following way. Do you not understand that everything from outside going into a person is not able to defile them, because it enters not into the heart, but into the stomach, and goes out into the latrine? The person, thus purifying all foods. In this reading, the clause communicates not that Jesus purifies all foods through his speech, but rather that a person purifies all foods through digestion. And I would recommend reading Logan Williams' study for a more in-depth analysis of the Greek. There are other textual traditions that also support and acknowledge the validity of this translation, and the belief that it is the person's digestive system that acts as a purifying agent that purifies the food or neutralizes the food. The scholar Logan Williams gives multiple examples as shown in the Peshitta of Mark chapter 7, verse 19. He states, the Peshitta of Mark chapter 7, verse 19c renders the participial clause with a relative pronoun such that the subject of the verb is not Jesus, but rather the digestive processes described in the previous clauses. It states, because it does not enter into his heart, but into his stomach, and it is cast out in excretion, which purifies all the food. Exhibiting a similar interpretation, the Old Syriac version of Mark renders the participial phrase as a full clause with a passive verb. Because it does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and it is cast out outside, and all food is purified. These translations suggest that very early readers of the Gospels were interpreting Mark chapter 7 verse 19c as Jesus' own comment about the digestive system rather than a comment from the narrator. We can see similar traditions and commentaries of a physiological interpretation showing that it is the person that purifies or purges all foods through acts of digestion. A 12th century theologian and commentator, for example, from Logan Williams' study, katharison padata brahmata means leaving behind clean food, kathara apolimpanon. For I say, when the filth, rupos, has gone out to the sewer, it leaves the pure food inside, which nature evidently retains inside the body. Another translation, such as the Latin Vulgate, uses a physiological interpretation of Mark chapter 7, 19 as well. Here I translated in English, because it does not enter into his heart, but into his stomach, and goes out into the latrine, cleansing or purging all foods or meats. And evidently, the King James Version also has this physiological reading of Mark chapter 7, verse 19. Also, the earliest interpreter of Mark, which is the Gospel of Matthew, we see the author state, do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? Here the author leaves out katharison padata brahmata, which means purifying all foods, possibly to remove any potential confusion of Jesus' statement of Mark chapter 7 verse 19. And or wasn't part of Matthew's concern to specify the anatomical arguments, strictly focusing on hand washing, establishing that this dispute is simply about the traditions of ritual hand washing. As stated in Matthew chapter 15 verse 20, these are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. Here the author clearly demonstrates that this isn't about eating prohibited animals, but about eating with unwashed hands. As Matthew Thiessen writes, in all 3 gospel accounts, Jesus' words about the dynamics of impurity suggest that Jesus has waded into a legal debate about the direction impurity travels. Impurity springs out of the body, it does not penetrate the body. Nothing suggests that the gospel writers intended to portray Jesus rejecting the Jewish dietary laws. The view that the stomach acts as a purifying agent that purifies all food is not unique to Jesus. This will be worth quoting in length. As the scholar Logan Williams states, the belief that the stomach functions to alter the qualities of food is not uncommon in ancient theories of anatomy. Whereas some argued that food was simply broken down into small parts, others stated that food also underwent a qualitative change during the processes of digestion. The reasoning of Galen and Aristotle, I think, is similar to the implicit reasoning of Mark's Jesus in Mark chapter 7, 18 through 19. For Galen and Aristotle, the fact that food entering the body is qualitatively different from excrement that comes out of the body entails that the stomach enacts a qualitative change. For Mark's Jesus, the fact that food entering the body, even if ritually contaminated by defiled hands, comes out of the body as ritually undefilable excrement entails that the stomach has a purifying effect on anything that enters it. We see precisely this kind of reasoning about purity, excrement, and the stomach in text from the Tosifta. T. McVault 7:8-9 provides the following ruling. If someone swallowed an olive spoke of a corpse and entered a house, the house is pure. For if everything that is swallowed by a human or cattle or a wild animal or birds is pure, if it decomposed or came out below as excrement, it is pure. If someone drank impure water and vomited it up, it is impure, because it was defiled when it came out. If one immersed, or if it decomposed, or if it came out below, it is pure. If one drank other impure liquids, if he immersed and vomited them out, they are impure, because they are not purified in the body. If they decomposed or went out below as urine, they are pure. If a cow which drank impure water vomited it up, it is impure, because it was not purified in the body. If it decomposed or came out below as urine, it is pure. So here we clearly see a kind of reasoning that entails that once something enters the body and it goes through the stomach, it purifies all foods, similar to the statement Jesus made in Mark chapter 7 verse 19. This pattern of reasoning is also found in Ohalot 12:3. It states, if a dog which ate flesh of a corpse entered a house, the house is pure. For everything that is swallowed by a human, or cattle, or a wild animal, or birds is pure. If he vomited it up, the house is impure. Logan Williams states, from these passages, Shlomo Naeh concludes that among the rabbis, a view emerges regarding the place of the digestive system of humans and of animals with respect to impurity and purity. That which is digested is purified in the body. The digestive system is a sort of purification machine which purifies all foods that enter it from the outside. So similar to them, Jesus himself makes that kind of reasoning. Whatever comes into a person does not defile a person, but coming out of a person through the digestive system cleanses or purifies all foods. This makes sense of the overall context. Jesus is within a legal debate on whether eating defiled food ritually defiled a person. And his reasoning is that, first, that's not stated in the law, and second, that the stomach itself serves as an agent of purification that purifies all foods. So this has nothing to do with eating prohibited animals. But if prohibited animals were in some sense being talked about here in this passage, and if an impure animal were to get ingested, it still wouldn't ritually defile a person, because prohibited animals are not impure in the same sense as ritual impurities. Prohibited animals do not defile a person in the same way ritual impurities would defile a person. So to insert prohibited animals into this passage would be a category mistake. Rather, it would defile a person morally. It is something that comes out from the heart, as disobedience towards God would be morally impure. Also, if Jesus was allowing others to eat impure animals, then he himself would have been a hypocrite by condemning the Pharisees and scribes for something Jesus is accused of doing. That is, abandoning the commandment of God, even when he said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, I have come not to abolish but to fulfill. So clearly Jesus is not abolishing or abrogating any laws in Mark chapter 7. Rather, he is giving a more strict interpretation of the law in Mark chapter 7. In conclusion, if someone claims that Jesus abolished the prohibition against eating unclean animals by saying that nothing entering a person defiles them, one can respond by distinguishing between the two separate categories, that is, unclean animals and ritual impurity, in which, according to the Torah and the historical Jewish view, these are not the same. Eating unclean animals does not render a person ritually impure, as corpses, genital discharges, or lepra does. The Torah never states that ingesting unclean animals transmits ritual impurity. Therefore, the subject of unclean animals is completely irrelevant. Thus, Jesus' statement in Mark chapter 7 does not abolish dietary laws. Rather, it addresses a misunderstanding of ritual defilement. The idea that food entering the body defiles a person is not supported by the Torah. and Jesus is correcting that misconception. Thus, Mark chapter 7 is not about abrogating dietary laws, but about clarifying the nature and source of ritual impurity. And if someone argues that Jesus abolished food laws by declaring all foods clean, one should first ask, what did Jesus consider to be food? What was within the premises of food to then be declared as clean? What did Jesus think in his own mind as food to then declare such things as clean? Also, the translation, "Thus he declared all foods clean," is textually debatable, as such a translation is a faulty interpretation caused by theological bias. So the overall context shows that Jesus is making both a legal and anatomical argument. First, that the Torah never states that eating unclean food causes ritual impurity, and second, that the stomach physiologically purifies what is consumed, since food does not enter the heart but passes through the digestive system and is expelled. Therefore, Jesus is not abolishing dietary laws, but correcting a misunderstanding about what causes defilement.